everybody. Land back. Let's get everybody in the room. Yeah. I cannot express how excited I am for this event. Let's get everybody in here. I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. I am Chief Thru, the North Carolina, South Carolina chapter leader of Black Hammer, and also the lead coordinator of the Political Education and Rally Subcommittee of the Political Education and Culture Command Committee. I represent the Tagalog nations of the Philippines, and my pronouns are they, she. First, I want to give a huge revolutionary salute to Chief Sante, the Chief of Political Consultant for our Commander-in-Chief Gazi, for making this event happen. We are so excited. We are going to be getting into some amazing conversation today about the Filipino struggle and the fight for liberation in the Philippines with our fellow comrades, Comrade Nikki and Comrade Adrian from Anakbayan, USA. Thank y'all so much for your willingness to do this with us. It means so much to us as a revolutionary organization that is working towards the liberation of all colonized people of the world. While folks get in the room, we're going to do a quick little icebreaker. I'm going to ask real quick to Chief Sante, what is the last Filipino meal you either ate or cooked?
Okay, so the last Filipino meal that I've eaten is probably lumpia. And I don't know if y'all know what lumpia is, but lumpia is basically these egg rolls. You can have meat in them or vegetables, and you usually have them with sweet chili sauce or banana sauce or ketchup. But you see, you have them in every Filipino party. Like every Filipino party you go to, they gotta have lumpia, they gotta have the spaghetti, and they gotta have that fried chicken. So yeah, that's the last meal I ate.
True that. It's not a party without lumpia, right? All right. Comrade Adrian, what about you? What's the last Filipino meal you either ate or cooked?
Y'all are making me hungry. The last thing I ate, it's called mongo. Mongo is like, it sounds like not the greatest in English. It's like mung bean soup. I don't know, but it's bomb. It has like the mung beans, like fried pork, tomatoes, if like bitter melon leaves, ampalaya. I don't know. Anyway, it's bomb.
Oh my gosh, ampalaya. My mom used to force feed me ampalaya or like bitter melon. She's like, you better eat your vegetables.
Oh, I can't do it. I can't do it. I'm like, did you rub enough salt on that? It's too bitter. All right, Comrade Nikki, what is the last Filipino meal you either ate or cooked?
So the last Filipino meal I had pinakbet and rice. So if folks don't know, I had some delicious vegetables, steamed and seasoned with some bagoong, actually. Yeah, with some bagoong. And it was great. That was actually one of the most satisfying meals I had in quite a while. So very happy, very satisfied.
I remember hating bagoong as a child, but then growing up, I was like, hold up, they were onto something. Like it's a fishy smell, but and it's really pungent. But yeah, you grow up to love that kind of stuff. But anyways, Chief Thru, let's take it on to our introductions for our organizations. My name is Chief Sante. I am the Chief Political Consultant for our Commander-in-Chief Gazi Kodzo. I represent the Kapampangan people from the island of Luzon. And I'm so excited to be here, y'all. I'm going to pass it over to our Commander-in-Chief, who's going to introduce to you our organization, our principles of unity, and all that good stuff. Land back.
Land back, everybody. My name is Gazi Kodzo, and I'm the Commander-in-Chief of the Black Hammer organization. Chief Thru, I didn't know you were doing so much. Dang, child. Thank you. Just position after position. Land back, y'all. I'm so excited about this panel and this discussion and this act of unity between Black Hammer and Anakbayan. It is just a huge honor in revolution to find common travelers moving towards an end of imperialism and colonialism and giving self-determination to poor working class colonized people. I am the Commander-in-Chief and one of the founders of the Black Hammer organization. And my political history before Black Hammer was actually centered around the liberation of African people, but then coming to a realization in my political journey that saw that, like Assata Shakur said, the same boot that was on my neck, I looked at the Vietnamese people and saw that was the same boot on their neck, the people in the Middle East and saw they had the same boot, people on the continent, people in South America, the indigenous people here, Australia, everywhere, the white man got around, child. And so, understanding that and seeing that, we have a duty for us to come together, especially in these times where it is so easy for us to come together, hence we're right here, with technology and everything, and just the trajectory and growth of our theory. And we started Black Hammer, and Black Hammer has 4 principles of unity. They're longer than what I'm going to lay out, but I'm just going to give you the basics. Number 1 is that we believe that colonized people, poor working class people, should have dictatorship over our land, lives, resources, and labor, and that as of right now, our land, lives, resources, and labor are being stolen by an alien nation. And that act is called colonialism. And we're going to learn more about that today and how that impacts the people of the Philippines. Number 2, principle of unity is that we believe that all colonized poor working class people are equal. It does not matter your gender, sexual preferences, different mental and physical abilities, where you were born, if you were a continental African or an African in America or whatever, your language, religion, none of those things. That the only line we see that divides us as colonized, oppressed people are the colonized, oppressed people that decide to be willing and able servants of white power, which we call neo-colonialism. Point number 3 is that we believe that colonialism and neo-colonialism are the root causes of all of the horrific things that happen within our lives as colonized people around the world. Colonialism being an alien nation dictating the land, lives, labor, and resources of another people and living as a parasite of those people. And neo-colonialism is, again, when we have people in our own colonized nation decide to be a part of white, or partake, because they can't be a part of, they wish they could, to partake in white power, colonialism, imperialism, and act those things on us. You're going to get some examples of neo-colonialism today as well that's going on in the Philippines. We call it, for me as an African, white power in blackface, like Barack Hussein Obama. And you're about to see white power in brown face, right? We're going to talk about that. It can come in all different shades, child. Evil like that. And number 4 is that we believe that the poor working class colonized people of the world are the true revolutionary class, and that it is our duty to lead the revolution worldwide, so we can usher in an existence where no one oppresses another. Land back.
Bam back. Thank you so much, Chief, for that introduction. I'm going to pass it off to Comrade Adrian from the Anakbayan US chapter. They are the chairperson for the Anakbayan US chapter. And I know Comrade Adrian personally, and I was actually part of Anakbayan and joined Black Hammer at the same time. So yeah, take it away, Comrade Adrian. Bam back.
Thanks, comrades. Yeah, my name's Adrian. I'm the current chairperson of Anakbayan USA. We're going to be talking a lot more about what Anakbayan is in a bit, but to give the short story, we are a comprehensive mass organization, meaning that we are organizing youth and students from different classes, different sectors, uniting them against our common enemy, and that we as a youth and student movement are rooted in the masses of people, that we're not just looking out for the interests of young folks, of students, but really who are the most exploited and oppressed in our society. And as Filipinos overseas, we even view ourselves as part of that movement for liberation in our homeland. We're also a national democratic organization, meaning that we're fighting for national liberation and genuine democracy, especially for the majority of people who don't even have a democratic right to land, right? And so, I'm serving as a chairperson in the executive committee alongside Nikki, who I'll pass to introduce themselves in a bit. But yeah, just real quick, how I got organized. I, have been part of Filipino organizations before, have always looked for something where I can really learn about my people's history, about my identity through political struggle and political work. And so an Anakbayan chapter is being formed when I was in school. I joined it. I learned a lot. I struggled a lot. But through that kind of like learning together with other comrades, through practicing actual, organizing in our community, was able to really develop an analysis of why are things the way they are, especially for the diaspora and how that links back home. And so ever since then, I've been really committed to this national democratic movement. Should I just pass it off to Nikki? Cool.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Nikki Pabulayan, and I am also with the Anakbayan USA National Executive Committee as its education officer. Thanks so much for having Anakbayan USA on, and just to share about my journey, my political journey. I found Anakbayan New York. I'm based in New York in 2015. I was very much set at that time to gunning for my PhD, gunning for a track to academia, because I really found out about the Philippines and, like the situation of our people there. But then there just came a point where I realized the only way to really know my community is to be involved in my community. So that's how I found Anakbayan New York on my campus and got involved from there on out. And here I am. So thanks.
Land back. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for introducing yourselves and the organization. Again, we're so thankful to be doing this. We can now start the discussion off with Chief Sante, who's going to give us a brief overview of the history of colonization in the Philippines as it relates to the land question. Take it away, Chief.
Land back. Thank you so much for y'all's introduction. I'm so excited to start this panel off. So if we can get the slide open for the land question, and I'll get started on that. So the history of the Philippines, where did it really begin, right? It began over 5 centuries ago when the Spanish Kingdom first arrived and landed on our shores. And that was really the inception of the country, the colonial country of the Philippines, right? And before we were even colonized, we had many nations, many tribes, many ethno-linguistic groups within these islands. They had, different cultures and ways of living. And one of them is the Kapampangan people, which I am part of, the Kapampangan tribe in the Philippines. We're based on the northern island of Luzon and spans like all the way to, I think, lower Manila. But we're known for our cuisine and our dancing. And during pre-colonial times, the Kapampangan people had a very complex religion with many divinities, and it dated even back to before Roman Catholicism, and was lost because of colonization. And prior to Spanish, colonialism, there was no such thing as the Philippines. And unlike many other parts of Southeast Asia, there was no great Asian empire that was on the land. But our people coexisted harmoniously. We traded with other countries like China. There were many Indian and Arab traders who engaged in extensive commerce in the land. And it was dating back to 1000 AD, much before the Spanish had arrived. And yet it was the Spanish government that bound thousands of islands, 150 groups of nations, tribes, different languages, different ways of living, different religions, bound them together under one single colonial rule, and drew up a map that delineated the Philippines as a single identity, as a single entity. And the Philippines is an archipelago. It consists of over 7,100 islands, 7,100 islands. And during Spain's when they claimed territory, it encompassed over 150 ethnic groups, it was estimated. And instead of submitting to the Spanish kingdom, the indigenous peoples of the Philippines remained fiercely independent or indifferent to the colonizer. They fought back, and they fought back for over 3 centuries, from 1500 to 1800. And in the 18th century, it was when Spain realized that they could not quell the rebellions of the Philippines, of the native indigenous people of that land, and that is when they brought in Catholicism. Over time, Spain's hegemony like heavily influenced the way that indigenous people viewed spirituality. We were a very spiritual people. We were connected to the land. Our land was, you know, our ancestors had worshipped the land. Even in our cultural dances, like we don't wear shoes or we don't wear our socks when we do these dances because we want to be connected to the land. And that is how close we are to our earth. And by the 18th century, indigenous people were banned from practicing any form of rituals that were tied to our religion. And they were called pagan and were punished for practicing them. Local histories that were written on bamboo and other materials were burned or destroyed by the Spanish kingdom. And so a lot of cultural knowledge, like ancient historical knowledge, was lost or destroyed due to colonialism. And so by 1898, Spain was, you know, still struggling to fight with the rebellions that were happening in the Philippines. This is over 3 centuries now, longer than Mexico. Spain was struggling to keep the Philippines under its colonial rule, and that is when the Americans came. So in 1898, Spain had released the Philippines to the US for a cost of $20 million US. And the US saw this as an opportunity to gain more of a financial foothold in Asia while extending its empire overseas. And that's when we saw the time of the Vietnam War, which was happening like simultaneously. And this brings us into World War II. As the United States continued to grow its empire leading up to, you know, the war, the Japanese Empire had also taken over a good part of our land. And it was around Manila where they had occupied. And this occupation under the Japanese imperial rule had killed over 1 million Filipinos, Filipinos just with the Japanese occupation. So we see that this empire also had a large presence in on our land and influencing our people. The indigenous and native people were either forced to work in the militias or work as servants to the officials and the priests during the Spanish colonial time. And only those who were members of the local elites, the former chiefs and their families. In the Kapampangan tribe, we call the chiefs datu. So we did have like a form of a government, and it was led by the chief who was appointed by the people. But in exchange for this exemption that the local the chiefs and the higher ups had with the colonial government was a sellout. Basically, they were colonial sellouts who collected the taxes from the people, gathered the labor, and made up for the shortages in order to give it to the Spanish kingdom. And not only did this forced labor create a system where the government ensured the subjugation of its most influential members of the native societies, it also created a class of sellouts that we see in repetition like throughout Philippine history, where natives sold their own people, the poor and working class, to the empire. Colonial authorities had granted extensive rights and privileges to favored landowners, and this had transformed the Philippines into this now political and economic dynasties that were owned only by a few people. And that's where we see the rise of the Marcos regime, and just the contemporary Philippine government and how it's rooted in corruption and nepotism, and ultimately a reflection of colonialism. And so with these three empires dominating over our lives, our land, our labor, our resources, we really see the need for an end to colonialism with the Philippines people, because really it's been over 500 years, 600 years, and who knows how long more until our people can finally and truly experience liberation and freedom. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Chief Thru, where they're going to be talking about the actual land of the Philippines and how beautiful and diverse it is. So land back.
Land back. Thank you, Chief Sante, for giving us that extremely important overview of the history of the Philippine Islands. It is super crucial for us to understand the history of colonization as it relates to the numerous issues there are in the Philippines today, as well as the issues that the Filipino diaspora are experiencing all over the world today. Like Chief Sante mentioned, before colonization, the archipelago made up of the 7,100 islands that is known as the Philippine Islands now were made up of various distinct nations of people. And I think it's very important to address, along with the history of colonization, where we were then or before the Spanish arrived. So taking it back over 600 years ago, before the over 150 groups of nations, tribes, and cultures were lost due to colonization, it's important to address that our indigenous pre-colonial ancestors were self-determining people that were deeply connected to the land. They knew that the land is sacred and believed that it was granted to them and entrusted to them by God, which meant that it was not subject to ownership, sale, purchase, or lease. They knew and believed that the land defined their very existence, as it provided them with food, resources, housing, and anything and everything they needed to thrive. For example, like Chief Sante mentioned, our indigenous ancestors would intentionally dance barefoot because they believed that it kept them connected to the land and that there should be no barriers between them. You know, our ancestors were one with the land. However, once colonialism took over and the Spanish imposed the Regalian Doctrine, declaring that they owned all the lands, the relationship to the land was ripped away from the people, and the colonial infrastructure was forced among the people to construct for the Spanish colonizers, and thus began the effects of colonialism that we see today. So fast forwarding 600 years later, right, we see that one of the most alarming issues that has affected and is currently affecting the Philippines is climate change. The colonial infrastructures have caused the islands to become extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, which we all know is a symptom of colonialism that affects the entire planet, right? So extreme weather, like the sewage pipelines that are causing excessive rainfall, typhoons have hit the islands, monsoons, earthquakes, cyclones, landslides, and even droughts causing the destruction of the lands and the natural resources, the displacement of the people, and the endangerment of the wildlife on the lands and the biodiversity in the ocean. The rising sea level is also a huge issue that threatens some of the lands to be underwater in the next 50 years. And if we go to the next slide, we see that the Philippine Islands makes up 70% of the Earth's biodiversity. So we have coral reefs that are just like dead, and like we have, you know, fish going extinct, and so many animals on the inhabitants of the land going extinct or becoming endangered species. So it's really an issue. And another important issue related to this is that of corporations and private investors that buy the lands that have been destroyed by these colonial created disasters like typhoons and gentrify them for foreign tourism for the petty bourgeoisie, right? To go and tour on the land that once belonged to the indigenous people that have been displaced, in some, if not most cases, have to rely on work in other countries outside of their homelands to provide for their families. So this issue of climate change is a huge contradiction that must be overturned. We must fight to take back our land if we want to ensure the survival of the Filipino people and our sacred land and all of its inhabitants, in order to have dictatorship over our land, labor, lives, and resources, and get out from under the boots of colonialism after over 600 years, to begin the healing that we Filipinos need, which is to become one with our people and with the land again. So, all right, y'all, I would now like to open it up to the panel for any questions, comments, or concerns y'all may have about this section. Land back.
Yeah, thanks for that, y'all. You know, one thing that, you know, I appreciate, especially with the talk of climate change, because that's really when the Philippines got put on the map, right? When the super typhoon hit in 2013, people suddenly, you know, knew where the Philippines was. There was a lot of, like, you know, charity concerns, that kind of stuff, but maybe not understanding what are the like really systemic issues that are behind climate change and that are behind even like the response after climate change, right? Where you mentioned like all the different capitalist imperialists started buying up the land, started to develop it, and now it's no longer for the people. Yeah, so thanks for bringing it back to that. What kind of work are y'all doing in the Philippines now?
Land back. So we have one comrade in the Philippines as of right now. Her name is Comrade Gabby. We we love her so much. She's great. We are looking to extend or really develop a chapter in the Philippines. But so far we just have one comrade in the Philippines. But we gonna get there.
Yeah, thanks so much for that history, for the extensive history to Comrade Sante and Comrade Thru. Like, I think something to reiterate too is that environmental defenders are the Philippines is the deadliest place, right? The #1 deadliest place for environmental defenders across the world, and it's very much because they are the ones standing against multinational corporations trying to take up their land. The national bourgeoisie and the landlord class also trying to take up land across the archipelago. So thanks so much for bringing it to that point, because it is very much that those who are defending land across the Philippines that are also standing against the semi-feudal, semi-colonial system, which we'll talk about, and of course U.S. imperialism trying to sink its claws even deeper into the country.
Land back, yeah. Thank you y'all for the comments. I really I agree with that. Like how it's like climate change, especially in the Philippines, is really magnified because of our not only the terrain in which we live on, but like also the infrastructure that was built on with colonial infrastructure that Chief Thru was talking about. Like the sewers in the Philippines are not great. Like the water does not drain out. It's just sitting there. Like it literally just sits there. And I think that with bringing down imperialism, bringing down colonialism, bringing down these the dictator that runs the Philippine government, like that really will show an improvement with the relationship to the land, because it's really like the people already know that we are connected to the land. We have nowhere else to go. Like that is our land. And if we cannot fight to improve our own land, then who will? Who will, right? So with that, I want to pass it off to Anakbayan, who's going to present on what work they're doing in the Philippines as well as here in the US. So take it off, Adrian. Land back.
Yeah, thanks for that. So we're just going to be, building off what Comrade Sante and Comrade Thru presented on the history, right? Because we know that there's all this really rich history of our people, rich history of struggle, and a long history of exploitation and oppression. And so Anakbayan was built in that context, right? And so I'm going to pass it off to Nikki to start us off.
Yeah, thanks so much again to Comrade Sante and Comrades Thru for that breakdown of Philippine history, and really highlighting, right, that the history of the Philippines is one of struggle, and one of struggle against the ruling elite by the vast exploited majority, from Spanish colonization to Japanese occupation and to now against US imperialism. So essential question when we think about the situation in the Philippines, that of the Filipino people, when we talk about, what are the root problems, is why is the Philippines so rich and yet the people so poor? And from the understanding of Anakbayan, of that of the National Democratic Movement, is that there are 3 fundamental problems that shape the exploitation and oppression of the Filipino people. And that's what I'm going to talk about before I pass it off to Adrian. And those 3 problems are US imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism. If you could go to the next slide, that'd be great. Next slide, please. To start off, the first basic problem that I'll really touch on is imperialism, or understanding capitalism at its monopoly stage, right? And to break that down, right, it's essentially that capitalism gave way for the free market, right, to concentrate production and capital into the hands of the few, which have created the conditions for control over the economy the military, of politics, and of culture, right? But because of the crisis of overproduction that capitalism has created, it's led to the situation in which, you know, imperialist nations have to go overseas in order to exercise further control, to dump the products of overproduction, et cetera. So this is where we see how the control of whole industries, of markets, raw materials, technology, and labor expands on a global scale. Where we see war being waged to maintain or take over territories to essentially solve the crisis of overproduction by imperialism. That's why colonies and semi-colonies such as the Philippines are necessary for imperialism, because the most important thing for capitalists is profit, right? So its colonies and semi-colonies, you know, provide cheaper materials, cheaper labor. They are essentially domains to set up markets for excess products that imperialists can't sell in their own countries anymore. Direct investments, you know, aid, colonial trade, all for the purpose of profit, right? And in the Philippines, we see at all levels an unequal relationship between the US and in the Philippines. And one example that we really especially want to cite today is the US-Philippines military relations. And the US's military presence in the Philippines. For example, there is the Visiting Forces Agreement. The Visiting Forces Agreement is a bilateral military agreement between the US and the Philippines that essentially allows an unlimited number of US troops to stay in the Philippines for an unlimited amount of time, doing essentially whatever they want. Right, so it gives them free reign to be in the country, to come in and out of the country, and for all intents and purposes, it's in fact, you know, de facto forever. And what makes the Visiting Forces Agreement so insidious is that it essentially allows for the U.S. to maintain a military presence without question. And why this is a particularly important example is that Duterte in February wanted to formally end the VFA with the US. And it wasn't because Duterte all of a sudden decided to become an anti-imperialist and was like, US, you know, get out. But it was because one of his cronies in the Senate, Bato de los Reyes, was denied a US visa. There were a lot of memes of him crying because, you know, they called him baby Bato, just because, you know, Duterte decided to, you know, do this as a bargaining chip to ensure that the US would grant him a visa. When for us in the National Democratic Movement, we've long been calling for the scrapping and terminating of the VFA because we want the US to get out. We didn't want the scrapping of the VFA on this basis alone of, you know, ensuring Bato, who was actually, fun fact, a chief enforcer of the war on drugs in the Philippines, has killed thousands of people, but because we are against US military presence, right? And so, you know, this we saw as just another one of Duterte's power moves rather than as an intentional step in getting the US out of the Philippines. Right. And, you know, we saw how superficial this decision was because in literally a few months later, this past June, the Philippines suspended the termination of the VFA, you know, so again, you know, the true character, right, of the relationship between the US and the Philippines, the US's military control of the Philippines was exposed. The VFA, you know, as one example of, right, the U.S. imperialism's hold in the Philippines. But something related to the VFA is, if folks do not know, is the murder of trans woman Jennifer Laude in the Philippines in October 2014. It's not just related to VFA. In some ways, in one way, you can say that the VFA creates conditions for the murder of so many Filipino women across the Philippines because U.S. Marine Joseph Scott Pemberton murdered her in cold blood. And once it was identified that he was the one who had murdered her, because of the Visiting Forces Agreement, the Philippines had no jurisdiction to trial him, had no jurisdiction to even put him in jail, because the VFA also has under the VFA, the U.S. has total jurisdiction over its U.S. servicemen for any crimes committed in the Philippines. So even when the evidence was there, the Philippines could not immediately put him on trial and could not immediately put them, hold him for trial. So we see here that even when U.S. servicemen kill our people, kill our women, kill our trans women, that the Philippines can't even hold jurisdiction over that, cannot even find justice. And it's because of legislation such as the Visiting Forces Agreement. And to add insult to injury, it was just 2 weeks ago that Duterte granted Pemberton absolute pardon. So no more legal impediments for Pemberton. Pemberton was released and is now in Hawaii. And, essentially, what we uncovered was that he had received special treatment when he was in prison. He received a heavily guarded and exclusive facility where only American personnel or Philippine government officials with clearance could see him. And so we see Pemberton's release as a clear example of the Duterte regime's subservience to the US. But we also see that it's because of military agreements such as the VFA that allow US servicemen like Pemberton to be in the Philippines in the first place and violate our people. Next slide, please. And so as if, right, it doesn't stop there, right? In terms of the oppression and exploitation that our people face. Feudalism in the Philippines, known as essentially the system of production where, the primary forces are the peasantry and the land that they till, and that those who till the land actually don't own it. And with this system, we actually see the primary crisis of land in the Philippines, something that we've all been, that we've been discussing so far in our panel discussion. And I think what's important to emphasize is that what this land crisis in the Philippines exposes is that when we think of fascism in the Philippines, in mass media, people immediately think of the drug war, right? People think of Duterte's drug war. But, if we are able to understand the conditions of the peasantry, the conditions of feudalism in the Philippines, we would say that fascism in the Philippines has existed in the countryside for centuries. And I think something to really to emphasize is that with feudalism, right, with this agriculture-based economic system, again, most farmers or peasants don't own the land and are forced to work for a landlord who profits off of excessive land rent rates, exorbitant loan interest rates, low crop prices, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. And this setup has become dominant across the Philippines, leaving almost 9 out of 10 farmers landless today, where peasants and families are forced to sell their labor to landlords, forced to, migrate domestically, to find work, or even across the world. And something else that is also worth reiterating is that it's because of the way in which feudalism maintains this backwards, small-scale farming in the Philippines, from which the ruling class can accumulate all this profit through their cheap labor and raw materials, that it actually creates a basis for imperialism to sink its claws into. There is some pictures here, right, of peasants who are tilling the land. But then if you see in this third bottom picture, facing you to the left, you also see farmers and farm workers who are being massacred. On the right, you're going to see also a protest of farmers and farm workers in this hacienda called Hacienda Luisita, which is this huge sugar plantation in the Philippines. That is thousands upon thousands of hectares or acres large, and that takes up pretty much 3/4 of this province called Tarlac in the Philippines. And Hacienda Luisita is a case study essentially for the egregious land grabbing, stealing, exploitation against peasants in the Philippines. It is reflective of the struggle of peasants that make up 75% of Philippine society across the archipelago. What we know about Hacienda Luisita is that during Spanish colonization, it was actually owned by a Spanish multinational stock company called the Compañía Española de Tabacos de Filipinas. But then over time, it eventually came into the hands of the Coanco Aquino family. If folks are familiar with Filipino history, Cory Aquino is someone who eventually became a president of the Philippines after Ferdinand Marcos was ousted out of power. But even though she was seen as this beacon of light for democracy, her family she's from a landlord class, and her family is responsible for the exploitation and oppression of peasants on Hacienda Luisita. In HLI, or Hacienda Luisita, is also a very clear example of the limits of bourgeois democracy. Throughout these decades, every legal and parliamentary recourse has been exhausted. Judicial and executive mediations at every level, mass campaigns, mobilizations, have only still left death and destruction for anyone who has resisted. On behalf of land reform or return of land to the peasantry. So Hacienda Luisita is a very crucial example in reminding us, that part of our struggle for the Philippines is a struggle for land, right, and return of land to the tillers. Feudalism in the Philippines is so crucial, is such a crucial problem because it is our people who are responsible for exporting some of the most crucial, or is responsible for being one of the top, producers of products such as coconut. We're the second largest, importer of coconut. We are responsible for producing things such as rice. Yet our people, the peasantry who work the land, who produce, these products, can't own it, cannot even afford to own or feed off of their own produce. Something like sugar, right? The majority of the peasantry, especially in Hacienda Luisita, are forced to produce sugar, but sugar can't feed our people, right? Sugar is not something that can sustain farmers and their families every day, yet they are forced to work the land every day. And I think, that's why, we will talk about, the return of land, the fight for agrarian reform is something that's really crucial to our struggle for national democracy in the Philippines. But next slide, please. And last but not least is bureaucrat capitalism, which can succinctly be described as the running of the government like a business, where essentially puppet governments, right, puppet bureaucrats and officials of the government have a role in essentially assuring the interests of the imperialists, the foreign elite, as well as the local elite, and essentially crushing the determined struggle of the oppressed masses through fascism, right? They help maintain the system, and from that, and in maintaining the system, they continue to assure and gain more wealth using their positions of power. Here, we see that, like, Duterte, for example, when he came into his role as president, he claimed to be against the U.S. He claimed to be against U.S. intervention in the Philippines. But as soon as Trump came into power, all these promises of getting the U.S. out of the Philippines, especially through military control, came out the window, right? You see here, Trump and Duterte have met, in the Philippines in 2017, and that caused mass protests across the Philippines that was met with brute force by the Philippine National Police. Some examples of bureaucrat capitalism in the Philippines is, in this top picture, you see this political cartoon of Duterte, essentially milking as much as he can from the Filipino people during COVID-19. So this PhilHealth is one example of this. PhilHealth is essentially this, PhilHealth Insurance Corporation is this government corporation that's attached to the Philippines Department of Health that administers national health insurance to all Filipinos. The problem with this is that, amidst mass employment during COVID-19, amidst, the need for repatriation of overseas Filipino workers who want to return home because of the pandemic, the Duterte regime essentially decided to enforce mandatory membership and to increase its premium up to 3% based on 3% of one's monthly salary on all overseas Filipino people, which is such a slap in the face against overseas Filipino workers who were asking for economic relief. Meanwhile, at this moment, Duterte saw this as a time to essentially, reap more profit, right? To essentially saw our OFWs as cash cows, for the reactionary government. And what was eventually found out is that it was exposed that the PhilHealth Insurance Corporation was pocketing all this money, billions and billions of Filipino pesos, money that should be going to the Filipino people, especially in time of health and economic crisis, right? So this is one concrete example of how the government is run as a business to profit off of the people as opposed to support the people. And one other quick example to really highlight is the intensifying fascism at this time. If people aren't familiar, this year, actually this past June, Duterte had the Duterte government had implemented the anti-terror law, which criminalizes all dissent against the government, right? As an attempt to ensure safety and security of the Filipino people. But what we as the National Democratic Movement understand, if who the genuine terrorists is the ones in office. It's Duterte and his cronies, right? That's where we see the government's role and essentially, hell-bent on crushing any struggle and resistance against the people. That even it's willing to deem an OFW complaining about PhilHealth as a terrorist, which is bonkers to think about, but is the reality. So with these three basic problems, if you can go to the next slide, comrades. Thank you. We see it create these three basic problems essentially shape the semi-colonial and semi-feudal system in the Philippines. Semi-colonial in that, the Philippines may be seen as an independent nation, but in reality, in character, it's not, because we see the indirect rule of US imperialism through the economy, politically, militarily, and culturally. We say semi-feudal because it's the existence of domestic feudalism in the Philippines that essentially creates the basis for US imperialism to indirectly rule the US. And because this agricultural system still maintains dominance in the country, we don't have our basic industries. Even if we have the raw materials to help develop vast industries, it's been held back because of the feudal system of production. So we really see the semi-feudal and semi-colonial system that forces the country to not be self-sufficient. It creates constant crisis. It creates debt. It creates poverty and oppression. And so we recognize that that it's there's no future under a semi-feudal and semi-colonial system because of the crisis created by foreign monopoly rule over the local economy and because of the feudal oppression in the countryside. As long as workers are getting exploited as long as workers are continuously getting exploited in the cities, as long as overseas Filipino workers are forced to migrate abroad and forced to work to remit money back home, as long as there are peasants working the land for absolutely nothing, there is no future under the system, right? Something to really emphasize is that under this system created by the three basic problems, the Philippines is so rich, yet none of it belongs to the Filipino people. The things they till, the things they build, things as basic and natural as land, things as basic as water don't belong to us, right? Which is what creates the conditions of exploitation and oppression. But as we know, that's also what creates and breeds resistance. So I'm actually going to pass it off to Adrian now to talk about the solution to these problems.
Thanks, Nikki. Yeah, so we don't want to like end on like, you know, exploitation and oppression is everywhere and then there's nothing to do about it. Because, you know, our people have known throughout history that the thing to do is fight back, right? And so for us in Anakbayan, we're part of a movement called the National Democratic Movement. It's, you know, it means something, right? It's not just National Democratic because it sounds cool, like it's two words together, but it's really a direct response to those issues that Nikki just brought up. What do we do if our country is a semi-colony, a neo-colony? We fight for independence, right? We fight for national liberation, and that's what makes it a national movement. What do we do if our country is semi-feudal, where the majority of people, 75%, don't have the right to even till the land or benefit from it? We fight for that democratic right to land that, you know, we're still fighting for, right? There have been so many other countries around the world that have fought for democratic revolutions to fight for land for the people. It's still not the case in the Philippines. And so we are a national democratic movement because we're fighting for national independence and genuine democracy, especially the question of land, right? But of course, you know, all the other democratic rights that aren't afforded to the Filipino people, right? Divorce still isn't legal in the Philippines because of all those colonial Spanish and influence from the Catholic Church, right? So that's our national democratic movement. But we don't want to just stop there. You know, we know that in revolutions in the past, people have fought for the same thing, right? National independence, genuine democracy. But their perspective was, how can we, you know, make the Philippines a power that can compete, you know, on par with like countries like the U.S., right, or other countries like that, in the frame of capitalism and imperialism, right? We don't want to be fighting for our people's freedom just to turn around and exploit ourselves again or exploit other countries, right? That's not the point, right? So that's why we are a movement that is national democratic, but with a socialist perspective, meaning that we're fighting for an alternative system that will actually put power into the hands of the most exploited and oppressed, right? And we'll go a little bit more into what that means for us in the national democratic movement. If you can go to the next slide. So, you know, in fighting for this struggle, we wanted to explain like who our friends and enemies are. You know, long before Occupy happened here in the States, the Philippines has had a 99 versus 1%. And that, you know, is true for a lot of oppressed people across the world, right? Our friends really and who we're fighting alongside are the most exploited and oppressed, right? What you see on the left side is a class breakdown of the Philippines. Where the majority, the 75%, are peasant farmers, magsasaka, right? That nine out of 10 of them don't own the land, right? There's also the working class, right? The 15% of the population, and that's shrinking because of imperialist companies are you know, pushing workers abroad, pushing people more into poverty. And so this is really where we see the leadership of the working class, the proletariat, in alliance with the peasant majority that we get our power from, that we get our strength from, right? Of course, we still see, you know, the importance of organizing amongst, even if they're part of the bourgeoisie, they're still being oppressed by the ruling elite. So among the petty bourgeoisie, even amongst the middle bourgeoisie who might own like some businesses in provinces that, you know, are struggling between, yeah, I want to produce for our country and the benefit of our country, but we know that, you know, they also have a want to become the imperialist corporations themselves too, right? And so in really uniting the 99%, we always come back to how do we have the solid alliance between working class proletariat leadership and the peasant majority in our country, right? But who are our enemies, right? You know, the enemies of the Filipino people are similar to a lot of enemies around the world, right? And those are the imperialists, right? Especially the U.S., given the long history of the U.S. in our country. So the U.S. imperialists are one. The classes in the Philippines that are really promoting the claws of imperialism to sink in are what we call a big comprador class, which means that they're really facilitating that business between multinational corporations and accumulating wealth in the Philippines for that very few, like less than 1%. And of course, the other big enemy of the people are the ones who are denying the right to land to the peasants. So the landowners, the big landowners, of which many Philippine presidents are, right? Of which many Philippine government officials are, right? And sometimes, they're one and the same, those big capitalists and then the big landowners, because that's just how much wealth they have, right? And so, as part of this too, we view ourselves in the Philippine diaspora as part of this class society too, right? And that we are part of this system in uniting the 99% to take down the ruling elite. Which brings us to, if you can go to the next slide, comrade. How do we fight, right? This is a question we get asked a lot, that the government of the Philippines tries to tag us a lot in terms of like, how does Anakbayan, how does the National Democratic Movement fight back, right? There is a vibrant decade, if not more, long history of legal mass movement building in the Philippines, where we organize in the streets, in pickets, in like forums, demonstrations, political education, you name it, right? Anakbayan is part of that long history of that mass movement, legal mass movement in the cities and even overseas, right? And we can explain a little bit more as we talk about like what Anakbayan does as an organization. This is like the background, right? So there's that vibrant mass movement, but we also know that the people's enemies will never go down without a fight, right? And that's just a fact, right? That's just a historical fact of people, not just in the Philippines, but around the world. And so that's why in the National Democratic Movement, we respect that the principal form of struggle, the primary form of struggle that people are waging to really bring about liberation, to bring about democracy, to get the right of land back, is through armed struggle. And the Philippines has the longest running armed struggle in the Asia-Pacific region, going on 51 years. It's being led by the Communist Party of the Philippines, which practices Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. And it also leads a people's army, what's called the New People's Army, which you see on the right side. Another big part of this armed struggle is a united front among all exploited and oppressed classes, right? The most consolidated of those is what we call the National Democratic Front, which are a bunch of underground organizations that are uniting youth, uniting women, uniting scientists, artists, peasants, all across the board for the purpose of bringing about genuine change in the Philippines. And so how does this armed struggle do it? It does it through what's called people's war, what the Philippine government, what the U.S. government might label terrorism, right? And it's not, if you look at the work being done in the countryside in the Philippines, it's the exact opposite, right? Because when we think of people's war, of course, there's the armed fights, right? There's the offensives that happen, the guerrilla warfare that happens. But it also looks like the peasants organizing and directly confronting their class enemy, the landlords, right? There are organized peasant organizations across the countryside that are confronting the big landowners and taking their land back, right? Setting up, the land and tilling it in the way that is actually beneficial for the people there. And then there's also the building of political power. We are specific in our words that the Philippines is going through a civil war because we know that there are two governments operating in the Philippines right now. The fascist government that's supported by the US and a revolutionary government that's supported by the masses of the people. And that revolutionary government is being built right now across the Philippines in revolutionary barrios, in revolutionary municipalities, where it truly is people's democratic government that is ruling in different areas, right? As a direct challenge to the U.S. Duterte regime, right? And so, that armed struggle is going to be a long fight because we don't, the people don't underestimate the enemy, right? And so it's a protracted people's war. They have a strategy around how do you build really power in the countryside until you're able to encircle cities. And so that's what the armed struggle is doing right now. There's a bunch of great YouTube videos, articles that y'all can search up and that we can share too. But just to give an idea of the scale of it, right? If you can go to the next slide. When we're talking about what does People's War look like in the Philippines, this is a map of it, right? The armed struggle in the Philippines is not just some like one-off thing that like a bunch of like radical terrorists are doing. It is something that is in over 90% of the provinces in the Philippines. There are over 100 guerrilla fronts that are operating right now to challenge the reactionary government in the Philippines. And so every province, this is a map of the different provinces in the Philippines, right? Every red part is where there is a guerrilla front, where the presence of the armed struggle is. And so it is a people's war to the core, right? When we say that there's a civil war, that there's a revolutionary government operating, it's a fact. And this map is trying to show that fact, right? So yeah, I mean, it is, the revolutionary armed struggle is happening, but at the same time, there's a legal mass movement that's also happening, fighting for national democracy. And so just wanted to close things off a little bit with, before we talk about what Anakbayan is doing in particular, with what our vision is, right? If you can go to the next slide. So, a lot of our families who might be like, why are you just rallying on the street? Or like, why did you just like yell so much on TV? You're just talking about all the problems in our society, right? And what we have to tell people, right? What we have to tell our community is that we recognize the problems, but we know the solutions too. We have a clear vision of what we want. In terms of our economy, we want land to the tillers. We want that right to land to be back into the hands of the people, right? We want to actually build industry to use the resources that are so rich in the Philippines for development, real development, right? We want to end any unequal agreements between the US and the Philippines, between China and the Philippines, right? In terms of politics, we want a government that is actually representative of the people who are exploited and oppressed, right? We want a democratic people's government based on that unity of people, but of course led by the proletariat. In terms of our foreign relations, we want to cut, any kind of unequal foreign relation, especially unequal military agreements that allow women to be killed, that allow trans folks to be killed, that allow for environmental degradation, right? And in terms of kicking out imperialist military, that also involves knowing that a people's military needs to be there, right? And so for the armed struggle, right, a people's army is being built right now. In terms of the culture, we know that it's such like a trauma for a lot of Filipinos overseas and even in the Philippines, right, where our parents wanted us to use like skin whitening soap, or like they'd like clip our noses so that we can have like pointy noses instead. You know how Filipinos have like flat noses? It's like a stereotype. There are so many different ways that in our culture has been incepted, right? From those very like physical things, but also to the way that we view our own people, right? There's a lot of like hate towards like the Philippine masses for being lazy, for being poor, when we know that there are systemic reasons for that, right? And so what we want to build is a pro-people, scientific, nationalist culture where we can actually celebrate our culture in a way that isn't exploitative, right? Where we can actually respect the self-determination of all the national minorities and oppressed nations in the Philippines without making them, spectators or like a public spectacle, which is what the Philippine government right now does, right? And so that's, in a nutshell, our program and what we're fighting for. So, Anakbayan is part of this bigger national democratic movement. And so we're almost, sorry, we've been like talking for hella long, but almost done. I'm going to pass it over back to Nikki to just share a little bit more about what Anakbayan does.
Yes, thanks so much, Adrian. If we can go to the next slide. So we're going to talk briefly about Anakbayan and our role in the National Democratic Movement. So again, Anakbayan is a comprehensive youth and student organization fighting for national democracy in the Philippines as part of the legal mass movement, really seeing it as our role to build political power of the masses, especially that of the peasants and of the workers, right? And Filipinos across the world, or kababayan across the world, towards the aim of national democracy. And so just to share some brief history, Anakbayan as an organization was, of course, founded in the Philippines in November 30, 1998 in Manila on the Tondo, Manila, on the birthday of revolutionary leader Adrian Bonifacio, leader of the Katipunan against Spanish colonization. And on the anniversary, the 34th anniversary of the founding of Kabataang Makabayan, a revolutionary Filipino youth and student organization that still exists to this day. And it was founded in recognition of the historic role of youth as a force that supports and advances social change against the old and rotten system for revolutionary change. Right? We recognize that that the revolution is unfinished. Right? In fighting for liberation and overthrowing both the foreign and local ruling system. So this Anakbayan was really formed from the understanding of the role of youth in revolutionary change and the importance of a comprehensive youth organization. What we mean by that is that that our organization, involves youth across all walks of life, right? Peasants, workers, students, professionals, indigenous peoples, et cetera, et cetera. And what we recognize is that it is as the lifeline, right? If youth are going to be the lifeline of the movement, that we need to ensure our integration with the most oppressed classes, right? Adrian was able to break down the class breakdown of Philippine society. Majority of youth come from, the majority of the peasant class, of the peasantry class, and of the workers. And so we understand that we needed a comprehensive youth mass organization, that are not only just, organizing other youths and students, but really being able to mobilize, to organize and mobilize thousands of youth across all sectors, especially those from the toiling masses, especially in a semi-feudal and semi-colonial society such as the Philippines, right? And so Anakbayan Philippines was founded in 1998, and then in 2001, we eventually had our first overseas chapter of Anakbayan in the US, founded in Seattle, Washington. And then in 2012, Anakbayan USA launched as official national organization. And at present, we now have roughly 30 organizations across the US, hailing from Hawaii to New York, to, again, Seattle, Washington, and, even to Research Triangle, North Carolina. With that, Anakbayan USA and Anakbayan is in the Philippines as well is part of, what we really see as our role is in serving the working class and being spokespersons of the masses. And why we want to ensure we do that is because we understand that, in order for us to achieve revolutionary change, right, it's not only going to be waging campaigns and struggles of the youth and students. It needs to be, based on a class line, based in understanding that that we will not achieve revolutionary change if there is not change to the conditions of exploitation and oppression of the workers and peasants. So, we strive to win over youth coming from all walks of life, but we also want to ensure that our work is in prioritizing those coming from the peasant and working class. And for us as Anakbayan USA, we also, want to ensure that, what we want to ensure Filipinos across the diaspora is that we are integral to the fight for national democracy in the Philippines. That we see ourselves as part and parcel of the very same the very same struggle, because we understand, right, that it is because of the three basic problems that have forced our people abroad, that have forced people to be scattered across the globe. And so it is important for for youth and students, Filipino youth and students in the U.S., to also acknowledge that we are an integral fight, and that all Filipinos across the world are integral to the struggle for national democracy. With that, Anakbayan is also part of a multi-sectoral alliance called Bayan, otherwise known as Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, which stands for New Patriotic Alliance. And this multi-sectoral alliance, representing people across all sectors, from the youth and students, to workers, to peasants, to women, to queer folk, to indigenous people. This multi-sectoral alliance was founded in order to unite all Filipinos across the Philippines and across the world to fight for national democracy in the Philippines with a socialist perspective. So we also have other national democratic organizations in the Philippines and here in the U.S. That are alongside Anakbayan as the youth and student sector in fighting for national democracy. With that, I'm going to now pass it off to Adrian to talk about what exactly our work as Anakbayan looks like from the Philippines to here in the US.
Cool. Yeah, so we're an organization that doesn't just like to talk about things and then like have an analysis about things and then like leave it at that, right? We study the world because we want to change the world. And so for the liberation of the Philippines, that means campaigns that really speak to the Philippine masses. There are some pictures here of the work done in the Philippines, right? Of course, during the pandemic, there's been so much effort to try to do like community health clinics in especially the most urban poor communities, in being able to really not just spread PPE and all those things, but also spread information and analysis of why communities are being left behind, right? And so that's been a huge effort. We also know that the pandemic has had a huge economic impact on workers and semi-workers in the cities. If y'all know what a jeepney is, it's like a form of mass transportation in the Philippines. A lot of jeepney drivers were affected. They couldn't drive anymore. And so they lost their only source of livelihood. Anakbayan was right there with them. Even before the pandemic, if anyone's been to the Philippines, y'all know like the traffic is like a hot mess. Like especially in Manila, it's like, you can go like 4 hours and then you went like a mile maybe. And so there's a mass transport crisis. And so Anakbayan also played a huge role in trying to call out the government for its lack of response to solving the issue of like, how do we actually get working people to their jobs? I mean, let alone if the government is even having jobs for the people anyway. And so Anakbayan has been there. There's also regular integrations to learn from peasant farmers in the countryside of what are their struggles against landlords, what are their struggles in trying to fight off like multinational corporations who are buying off their rice for like mad cheap, even though they're toiling out for like 10, 12 hours a day to do it. And those are also opportunities in the Philippines that we send our own members to for what we call an exposure program, where it's not a vacation, it's not just like to have some kind of savior complex, but where we can really show our members like what the fight that they're an integral part of is, and to organize alongside people there to help really build our community's political power together. We also know, of course, that there are Filipinos overseas. There's almost 5 million here in the U.S., and that despite the colonial propaganda that America is like the land of milk and honey, and there's the American dream here. When our families migrate here, it's working class poverty, right? And so there's so much work to be done here in our communities. We've also been doing a lot of aid efforts with our communities during this pandemic in delivering goods, resources, PPE, etc. We also are definitely monitoring the relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines. The picture on the top right is our chapter in Hawaii when they protested the camp that the murder of Jennifer Laude was sent to. So, quick mobilization to tell them that, like, we're not gonna let y'all get away with this, right? And then, of course, other campaigns around gentrification, around how do we be in solidarity with worker strikes in the Philippines, against police terror, against neoliberal attacks on our education system, against political killings in the Philippines. And our biggest campaign right now is, given that Duterte is such a clear fascist, given that he is wholly supported by U.S. imperialism and other imperialist powers, our biggest campaign right now is how do we get this person out, right? So we have what we call the Oust the U.S. Duterte regime, where we know that people power has ousted presidents in the past. Where we need to not fall short this time is making sure that after we oust a president, we're able to have the people take power and not another member of the ruling elite. And so we say oust the U.S. Duterte regime and struggle for national democracy and socialism in the Philippines. And that is Anakbayan. Thanks, y'all.
Man, back. Thank you so much, comrades Adrian and Nikki, for that amazing, amazing presentation. There's so much that I've learned just about the revolutionary struggle of our people that's happening right now. And honestly, like, I'm so emotional from like learning about all of this. Like, I know it's supposed to like hype me up and like be like ready to go out there and be with the people and fight amongst them. But like, really, what I took from this is that we have such a huge burden on our hands, and that really the only way to overcome all the problems that we're experiencing, not just Filipinos, in the mainland or Filipinos abroad, but like everybody is suffering under colonialism. And colonialism, we in Black Hammer believe, is what is causing all these symptoms that we're experiencing, like from the killing of Jennifer Laude to like how our country deals with climate change, and how our country is able to like subjugate over 75% of the population as peasants. And my family back in the Philippines, we're actually from Pampanga, the city near Tarlac City, which you just brought up, but it's like countryside. And we're from a poor and working class background. And the first time that I went to the Philippines, I really saw like there's just a movement there, like with the people, with the toiling masses, with the poor and working class. And they don't just fight back. They build a community with the people. They we eat with them. We have our doors wide open for anyone to just come in and be like, hey, you want some like pancit? You want to eat some fried chicken? Come on in. Like, that is how our people are. And like, really what I've learned from this, and what I've learned from what Anakbayan is doing in the Philippines, is just such a, like, it's so powerful to me. And like, as a overseas Filipino worker who's currently here in the United States, like the one thing that I want to see out of this revolution is, to take our land back. And really what taking our land back is taking our resources, taking our labor that was coerced to build for white power, colonial capitalism, imperialism. That is what I want to see an end to, and that is what I see as the only solution for our people. And land back. I just salute y'all and Anakbayan and the work y'all are doing. Like, really.
Land back. I really wanted to appreciate that political education, and also looking into like the framework of the organization and the amazing work that y'all do, and just like bewildered, because I'm sure like y'all's organizational chart must be very complex. Like, that's awesome how y'all are like organizing worldwide and using the resources and the people power from like around the world to struggle and be in assistance with the liberation that's right there. And that's just super duper powerful, because something colonialism does love to do is to separate us from our people, right? Some of us stolen from colonialism, and the rest of us also stolen from colonialism, because even when colonized people around the world want to even aspire to come to America or come to, you know, the United Kingdom, whatever, these white imperialist nations, it's because these white imperialist nations are shiny off of the stolen resources of those colonized people. So we're just like consciously or unconsciously following our own resources, right? And then they use us and our skills and our brilliance, again, to build for capitalist imperialism. Like in Nigeria, most of Nigerian doctors actually live in New York City, right? Not Nigeria. And it's that exploitation of all of the resources, including of the people and their skills and their brilliance and intelligence. So it's really empowering to see that y'all have built these organizational frameworks to build in the universities, right? And find, you know, the Filipino people and being like, look, this is the struggle that's happening, and connect them to it right there, and turning these universities in America, these schools in America that are supposed to be reproductions of the bourgeoisie ideology, right? And reproduction of people that can be used in high places by capitalism, and that y'all are going into those places, and instead of making them training camps for capitalism, you're making them training camps for the people. So that's really dope and powerful. I had a question, and I know Chairman Adrian, you talked about a little bit, but I was wondering if you could talk about just a little more. But I know that, you know, in the Philippines, the people rose up, right? And the Marcos regime like left, and, you know, with the diamonds and the shoes and all those things, right? Shout out to Emilda. Anyways, but yeah. And now, you know, seeing that the Marcos regime is rising up again right now as we speak. And so I was wondering, like, how did that, one, happen? They coming back and now on the rise? And two, what relationship does that, the Marcos regime, play with this new neo-colonialist regime that is right now enacting all of these horrific state-sanctioned violence against the people, anyone that even whispers a criticism, no matter how liberal, against the government, land back, against the neo-colonial puppet government, land back.
Yeah, thanks for that. You know, Marcos, for those who aren't as familiar, Ferdinand Marcos was a dictator in the Philippines in the 60s, 70s, 70s, and 80s. He was there for a while. And part of the reason he was there for a while is because he declared martial law. Actually, last week was the 48th anniversary of the declaration of martial law in the Philippines, and Anakbayan held mass actions across the country to condemn it, because we also know that martial law exists in the Philippines right now, whether or not Duterte calls it that. You know, Marcos fell out of power for a long time, but because of the way that those three basic problems work, they still had the wealth and the influence to remain in government, to remain not just like provincially, but also in the federal government, right? Imelda Marcos has been a long time congresswoman in the Philippines, and her children, right, are also in Congress. You know, the really messed up thing about the rise of the Marcoses again is that the current President Rodrigo Duterte helped to enable it, to enable the what's it called, the political revival of the Marcos family as a contender. And so, you know, he basically washed the history clean of the Marcoses' crimes against the people. There's a huge controversy back in 2016, I believe, when there's like a hero cemetery in the Philippines where presidents and other, you know, national heroes have been buried before. Marcos was not buried there because he was remembered as a dictator by many. Duterte facilitated the burial of Marcos, his remains, in that hero cemetery. And so, you know, literal like historical revisionism, like physically, right, putting them back in power. Marcos's children that are in national politics, he's also been working together with them, has helped to prop them up. And we all know that, you know, Duterte kind of idolizes Marcos as this dictator because it's what he's trying to be. You know, he's trying to declare all these martial law. He's trying to call everyone a terrorist. You know, the same counterinsurgency, the same fascist tactics that Duterte is using right now are from the playbook of Marcos. But I wouldn't just leave it there, right? Comrade Sante gave a really good rundown of how in the history, the U.S. set up an education system, like a class mobility system, to keep the ruling Filipino class in power as a puppet for the states, right? And so it's not just been Marcos, right, who's been a puppet. It's been every single Philippine president, including the one who came right after Marcos, right? Nikki mentioned that Cory Aquino, right, the mother of actually the president right before Duterte, came after Marcos. Less than a year into her presidency, Cory Aquino's presidency, peasant farmers marched to the presidential palace demanding rights to land that she promised them, right? She called the military and opened fire on them. And so that's something that's happened throughout Philippine history. So Duterte right now is just, the latest in a series of fascists, of puppets. But of course, he takes a special place in history as someone who really is terrorizing the Filipino people without any kind of remorse at all.
Thank you so much for answering that. Thank you. Oh, and I want to mention that when they did, when the Marcos regime and that family ran away, it was America who caught them comfortably in Hawaii and set them up on stolen land and set them up with not a mansion. It's even bigger than that. Like when you just have land upon land and houses upon houses, like I forget what it's called, but they basically gave them a huge part. And and to see that they literally left Hawaii to go back to the Philippines just to enact murder and genocide, literally.
Land back. Thank you, Chief and Chairman Adrian. We got a question from one of the comments. How does the neo-colonial Filipino government try to get the people to reject the National Democratic People's Government? To what extent is it successful?
Nikki, you want to answer? There's so many different ways.
I think I'm just kind of racking my brain. I mean, Adrian, please feel free to add, but I think for one, there are several ways in which the reactionary government tries to delegitimize the revolutionary government in the countryside. For one, even before Duterte came into power, there's just been a long-standing practice of red tagging, of demonizing organizations or activists, demonizing them as terrorists, putting out quote-unquote fake news about the revolutionary government, as one that terrorizes the people, as opposed to providing the solutions that the puppet government should be providing. I think for some concrete examples are that under Duterte, he has laid out such an extensive counterinsurgency plan against the people's government, against the revolutionary government, against revolutionary underground organizations, and there is, I think one example is his program for the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, which is essentially a way to essentially creates this force was essentially meant to squash any any of the dissent presented by by the New People's Army, by local facets of the revolutionary government across the countryside. And but in actuality, it also creates this bureaucracy. It mobilizes all forms of bureaucracy of the puppet government to essentially push forward this military scheme to squash the armed struggle happening in the countryside. There is, and it is a national task force, and the NTF LCAC is also responsible for creating fake news through fake Facebook pages that put out falsities against activists and revolutionary organizations. That deems them as communists that have terrorized the people. And there is also the Executive Order 70, which is essentially meant to weaponize the civilian bureaucracy weaponize the civilian bureaucracy towards surveillance, towards killings, towards creating false stories about these organizations, these activists, and what they do. So anything from the Department of Immigration to the Department of Health can be weaponized against the people's government. I think something to just emphasize though is that in terms of its success, I think something that has been said about our fascist dictators in power, especially that from Marcos to Duterte, is that they're actually the #1 recruiters to the NPA. They're the #1 recruiters to revolutionary organizations, because it is the fascism that they implement. It is despite that they implement, it is because of the utter repression and exploitation that people are so moved to take up armed struggle, or they are so moved to even, become activists in the cities. So, despite these scare tactics, despite all these loopholes, right, that are like, the ways in which they utilize the bureaucracy to demonize activism and to scare people out of activism. And even, the attacks on mass leaders, such as Randy Echanes, who is this who is a leader of the National Democratic Peasant Organization in the Philippines. Even the murder of our mass leaders, though, we grieve over them. We recognize, that the reactionary government is meant to, to quell our dissent, is trying to scare us from doing exactly what we need to do, because we're doing a good job of it. We're doing a good job of building a new world in the shell of the old, and then resolving the people's problems that, that the reactionary government can't solve. I think just one fun fact is, it's worth saying that that the UN, commended the revolutionary government for its response to COVID-19. But it was radio silence for the Duterte government. And it's because the revolutionary government is, doing what it can to serve the people. That's why the reactionary government is hell-bent on destroying them.
Thank you so much for that, Comrade Nikki. Do we have one more question for Anakbayan? Ooh, so it says, how does Anakbayan see how other colonized people can support the movement in the Philippines? Awesome question.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different ways, right? Of course, I mean, we can plug if y'all want to donate to Anakbayan, we have a Venmo. We are a grassroots people's organization, and so we really rely on grassroots support, right? We don't want to be funded by the imperialists, compromise our political program and our vision for the Philippines. So definitely donate if y'all have the means, or reach out to friends who might be interested. We have chapters all across the country, all across the world. And so if, y'all want to link up, we can definitely talk more about where our chapters are at, and then how we can actually do work on the ground together among Black Hammer or other organizations, right? Other ways that folks can support is that, we have a lot of different campaigns out right now. I already mentioned the Oust the US Duterte regime is a big one. If y'all want to show some love and show some solidarity with the Filipino people's struggle to really oust this fascist dictator, any kind of statements y'all put out or solidarity messages go a huge way in showing that it's not just like a few people who think Duterte is bad, but like the world. Like the world thinks he's like a bad president, right? And so, you know, that would be amazing. We're working with some allies in terms of a really concrete way to affect the military relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines. Some allies have initiated legislation. Actually, you know, they're trying to see what kind of reforms can be done. Right. Of course, for Anakbayan, we know what our vision is, but we know that reforms can also bring alleviation to the people sometimes. And one of those things that's actually going through U.S. Congress right now is a bill to cut U.S. military aid to the Philippines. Right. And we know that's important, not just because it's military aid that funds the killing of Filipinos back home, but because that's money that should be going towards healthcare for us here, for education, for social services, right? We're living in a pandemic, and you know the government gives us like what, $1,200 one time, and like I'm in California right now, that's like not even rent, right, for a month. And so you know, but at the same time, hundreds of millions of dollars are going to support Duterte's fascism in the Philippines. So if y'all want to check out, it's called the Philippine Human Rights Act. Y'all can check out humanrightsph.org for more information about that. But it is a campaign that we're waging alongside some allies too. But yeah, hit us up. There's so many different ways to work together, like on the ground and in fighting against imperialism from the Philippines and for oppressed people all over the world.
Land back, yes. I heard that y'all have the new chapter in the Research Triangle, which is where I am. So I will be contacting them. That is so exciting. I just want to say thank you so much, y'all, for that amazing political education. I've learned so much, and I'm also really emotional. Like this, y'all, the work that y'all are doing is amazing, and I just want to give a revolutionary salute to y'all and to the organization. I am, yes, salute. I'm a little nervous. So now we are going to move it on to, I do want to bring something up. There is a quote I know that I've seen a lot with Anakbayan that says, "Huwag matakot," right? Which means have no fear. And I just really want to bring that saying into the space, you know what I mean? Because we are all colonized people here that are working towards the liberation of our people. And I really think that like having, you know, like just like remembering or like just keeping that saying, "Huwag matakot," like have no fear, we are all in this together, you know what I mean? In this fight together will really like push us forward. So yeah, we are going to move it on to Hammer City, and we are going to have our very own Commander-in-Chief Gazi. Go ahead and tell us all about it. Land back.
Land back, another land back salute to our comrades from Anakbayan. Those were great presentations, Comrade Nikki and Chairman Adrian. So my name is Gazi Kodzo, and I'm here to talk to y'all about Hammer City. So what is Hammer City? So as you know, Black Hammer is an organization of poor working class colonized people fighting against colonialism. Just like Chief Sante laid out, we believe that colonialism is at the root cause of all of the contradictions that poor and working class and all colonized people face. We understand that, you know, Europe went through a crisis, an economic crisis that was caused by the Black Plague, and that they did all kinds of sick and twisted stuff to get out of that economic crisis. You know, if you don't know now, a pandemic kind of messes up your economy. So when Europe was going up against the Black Plague, because they wasn't washing their behinds, the Black Plague that took out a third of their population, that causes an economic strife, right? It's also the reason why the Catholic Church created purgatory. Yes, they created purgatory before there was just heaven and hell, but the Catholic Church needed some resources, so they made up purgatory and said, hey, your grandma in purgatory, but if you pay us, we'll send her to heaven. And so it was like literally an economic scam out of the people. And so different European nations came together and said, how do we solve this economic contradiction? And they looked to Africa and other nations around the world and said, hey, you see these indigenous people from all around the world, they are hella wealthy, hella clean, and they got hella resources. So they attacked Africa and other colonized nations around the world and enacted colonialism worldwide, where basically and colonialism is when an alien nation has dictatorship over your land, lives, and resources and labor, and uses it to build up their economy, and therefore your economy is left in shambles. That is why when you are looking at the history of all of these colonized nations, what do we have in common? We was rich before you crackers came. You know what I mean? We was rich. We had resources before these imperialists came, right? Before these colonizers came. And so they came to take those resources and then came to also take that labor. And at some colonized nations, what they did was create settler colonialism. That's how you have Israel. That's how you have the United States of America, Canada, South Africa, Australia, where they went and decided to stay and populate there. And then you have non-settler colonized nations around the world that, even though white people aren't there, what they have done is enact neo-colonialism and has created a class called the petty bourgeoisie class to enact the will of white power and to sustain that looting relationship that those colonized nations have to white power. And those white power forms come in the forms of nations and also come in the forms of these businesses and these international banks, right? And they loot our resources and sustain them as the parasite, which colonialism is, which gave way to the birth of capitalism, the fattening of these resources, and took Europe out of feudalism into capitalism, where you didn't have to be a king and queen or a landlord to be part of the ruling class. White people can now contend with one another, and you can have a poor working class white person become a multi-billionaire like a Jeff Bezos or like the Apple guy, I don't know, and Bill Gates and things like that, right? You don't have to be a king or queen. You can have those kinds of resources. And that's why Europe had a lot of their kings and queens left, while others, monarchies or whatever, decided to adapt to the times, like the United Kingdom, and create a parliament or some separate governmental thing that will handle the people. Meanwhile, they're still wealthy as hell off of the resources of colonized people. Like, seriously, like the Queen of London or whatever, like her entire crown is nothing but like stolen jewels from Africa and India, and nobody says nothing. So anyways, yeah, so we understand that. And we also understand that right now we are facing this pandemic of COVID-19. And just like with the Black Plague, what is white power doing to solve these issues that they are dealing with economically is to enact and deepen their fangs in the flesh and land and resources and labor of colonized people locally and around the world. For example, here locally in the United States of America, they enacted what they called essential workers, which was basically Black and brown poor working class workers that were forced to still work under the COVID spread and get COVID-19 and come back to our poor working class colonized communities and spread it. And then when we get sick, go to these hospitals that are made not for us as colonized people and has been nothing but, antagonistic and genocidal towards African and colonized people. So then we weren't able to get access to different resources and things like that to help us from COVID. So then they were like, oh my gosh, shock and awe. The number one people when it comes for like the death rate and capacity of spreading, is Black and brown people. Oh no, like y'all designed it that way, right? Because colonized people in America can't afford Uber Eats and Amazon, shopping off of Amazon for grocery stores like 24/7, like these white folks can, right? So we have to go to these grocery stores like Walmart and get COVID-19. On top of that, not just getting sick, the economic crises, and the unemployment of people, so that these billionaire businesses can contain and gather up all their resources. They have let go and fired majority, again, shock and awe, colonized people, right? that were living paycheck to paycheck to begin with and are now filing for unemployment. You see in California is not taking any new unemployment submissions because they are 600,000 approved submissions that they haven't even gotten a paycheck to yet. That's not just speaking the millions of people that applied in California, but it's just the 600,000 that they have approved and not yet paid. So we understand that it's going to be our people that are let go. And they say that, 42% of the businesses that were lost the jobs that were lost are not coming back anytime soon. And so obviously we see how that has enacted with these landlords kicking out African and colonized people at record rates, and African and colonized people having nowhere to go. And it's just getting worse and worser, as my mother says, every day. And so Black Hammer has been trying to meet the issues of colonized people around COVID-19. And we see those same kind of acts of colonialism trying to rip and tear its fangs deeper into colonized people, also with mass incarceration on an increase, because ain't nothing better than free labor when you're going through an economic crisis, right? So African and colonized people in America are being locked up at record rates, which also means we are being shot and killed by the police at record rates, even with these mass protests that you see with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. It's actually been a hike in the murder of African and colonized people by police. I think we passed 1,000 already in midsummer, and they're still counting. And so when we look at other colonized nations, we see America and Europe all together using the most visceral, upfront, imperialist attacks to sink in their fangs even deeper into the resources of colonized people. For instance, what happened recently in Lebanon, and you see France coming in and saying, hey, we want to be your leaders once again, right? And they're like, oh, okay, yeah, all right. And then France is coming to save Lebanon when really France can't save nobody. France is in an economic crisis and also stealing even more resources from the Congo as we speak. And we also see neo-colonialism, white power in colonized faces, enacting its will on colonized people around the world. As you see in Nigeria, thousands of people are being murdered by the police in Nigeria because of COVID-19. The people are starving. The people want masks. The people want education around what's going on with COVID-19 and all of those things. And all they want to tell the people is stay in your house. And if you come out, we're going to shoot and kill you. And that's exactly what they've been doing. Same thing in South Africa and around the world. So long story short, when COVID-19 first hit, Black Hammer was hitting the streets, getting our people what they needed to protect themselves as far as PPE, which is medical grade masks, gloves, hand sanitizer, soap, herbs, vitamins, and all those kinds of things for like immune boosters. We even got a Black Hammer tea, y'all, and things that we know as colonized people that help boost our immune system and things of that nature. And we did this here in the United States of America. We also did it in Brazil, in Nigeria. Shout out to Gabby in the Philippines. And was doing the best that we could do to get that out. And with that project, we've gotten so far 100,000 pieces of PPE out to poor working class colonized people around the world. So big shout out to y'all for doing that. But getting deeper into this struggle and the crises even becoming sharper and sharper every day, we have seen clearly that we needed a long-term solution for our problem. And that when we were going out and doing outreach amongst our people, and when we go do outreach, I don't know where a lot of these, I don't know where BLM and them be because I don't be seeing them, but we go to the hood. I'm gonna be really honest. We go to the hood, we go to the poor working class colonized communities where you better be good at dodging because there's a drive-by, shoot them up, bang, bang. That's where we be because that's where our people are at, right? The scary places. And we go amongst our people and, you know, and most of us already live in the scary places. That's why y'all see me be looking outside my window, just making sure if I need to get down. But so we go to these places and we see that when we're giving them PPE, when we're giving them food, it's still other needs that they need. And we can't say that we are servants of the poor working class, right? If we don't give them the long-term trajectory, right? As you see our comrades in Anakbayan struggling and doing that with their people. It's about the long-term thing. It's not charity, right? It's revolution. So we decided to build Hammer City. And what is Hammer City? Hammer City is liberated ground that we are going to have under the dictatorship of the colonized proletariat, depending on where that liberated grounds and land is. For instance, here it's going to be in Florida, which is on Turtle Island, which is belongs to the indigenous people. So we have a council of that we call land liberators that represent a myriad of indigenous comrades of Black Hammer that represent different nations of Turtle Island coming together, creating constitutions and laws and an economy where no one lives at the expense of another. And you may see some of our posters where we say no rent, no cops, no corona, no white people, right? And to give a safe haven to colonized people, and also to not like run away from colonialism, because you can't, it's everywhere, right? But as an affront to it, and to expose the land question, which is at the core of the contradiction with all colonized people around the world. That we met colonialism, capitalism, imperialism by the barrel of a gun. We met it by the theft of our language. We met it by the theft of our religion. We met it by the theft of our society, our self-determination, the theft of our history that we will never get back. You know, while these white, poor, working class people met imperialism by the fattening of their pockets. They went from being peasants in feudalism in Europe to the fattening of their pockets to now being able to own 2-door garages and a big old Mack truck with a Trump flag waving, right? This is how they met imperialism, capitalism, imperialism, by them getting wealthy. We met it by us losing everything, right? That's why I had to find my name, Gazi Kodzo, instead of the white name that was forced on me. And so we understand that the land question comes first, because the issue is we was doing fine, then you came and started taking everything from us. And for us to actually have self-determination, to practice self-governance, we have to contend with the land question and expose that to colonized people worldwide, and even expose it in neo-colonialism, because people may think because there's Africans in the government in Nigeria and Africans in the government in South Africa and Filipino people in the government of the Philippines, that is really a representation in the government of the Filipino or African people. And it's not. It is a puppet government that was created to do exactly what it is doing right now, stealing our resources, our land and labor and lives, right? And crushing anything that attacks that status quo, period, right? That is what these puppet neo-colonial governments do. They do not serve the interest of the people. They serve the interest of the people that put them there in the first place, which is white power, capitalism, colonialism, imperialism. And, you know, when Africa was divided into 54 different countries, that meeting was done in Europe, and there wasn't an African in the room. There wasn't an African in the room. And I bet to gamble and say that when the Philippines was collected from over 7,000 islands and made into one nation for Spain, that there was no Filipino people in that room, right? There was no indigenous people in that room. It was literally white people. And because white people created what we may understand as nations, but really just looting territories of who gets what loot. And that's how Spain sold those collection of islands off, for $20 million, like they were selling a car. That's disgusting. And that's what we have to overturn. So that is our project with Hammer City. After we finish Hammer City, Turtle Island, we'll be doing Hammer City in Nigeria. Shout out to our Nigerian chapter. And doing that all around the world as us taking forward this land question, also seeing that imperialism is falling. We see it every day. The chieftain hegemony, you know, king of all white power imperialism, the United Snakes of America, is falling, and it is being exposed every day that it is incapable of healing itself, of fixing its issues, or any of those kinds of things. And the colonial question is rising. That's what you see when you see George Floyd. That's what you see when you see Breonna Taylor. What you see is colonized people resisting and being sick and tired of genocide. When you see that it is a connection to the struggles that are happening in Palestine from those 4 little boys that were playing volleyball on the sand and got missiled down by an Israeli ship, right? And those people rising up, that is anti-colonialism. It is anti-colonialism. When you see the people rising up in Africa and in South America, and the indigenous people here, right, fighting against these pipelines, they're not just mad at these pipelines, they're mad at the fact that they do not have self-determination and want to fight to overthrow that so that they, right, can be dictators over their own land, lives, and resources, and not be at the whim of this crock show we call an election, which is just a peaceful contest of power between sectors of the white ruling class of who's going to have their boot on our neck next, right? In what fashion? And if that boot is going to have, I don't know, rainbow stripes on it or the Confederate stripes on it, but it's still going to be a boot on our neck. But land back. Is there anything else to talk about Hammer City, Qatari? That's good? Okay, good. Land back. Oh, where we at in Hammer City? Okay, so Hammer's in your hood. Perfect. So you can donate and support Hammer City at Build Hammer City, GoFundMe.com/Build Hammer City, and Cash App Build Hammer City. You can actually look and see the different updates we have. This is a serious project. I know we are, you know, poor working class colonized people. So when you look at us, you may think, oh, this is a joke, whatever like that, because, you know, white power has informed you not to take colonized poor working class people seriously. That's fine. We use that in our advantage. But we have a whole team that is set up, right? A power team, a water team, the team for farming, agriculture, all of those kinds of things around Hammer City, around the laws and bylaws and the Constitution. And you can see all of that when you go to GoFundMe.com/Build Hammer City. It's a serious project and really excited for its building. And then next we have Hammers in Your Hood. Hammers in Your Hood is our outreach program of Black Hammer members out all over the United States of America and other parts of the world, going where we said we go, right? To the poorest, deprived, you know, communities of our people. And we give them political education about, you know, what's happening, what's going on. Colonialism, we give them the ability to join and partake in their liberation movement. We also pass out PPE and food and clothes and things of that nature to give our people some alleviation, and also to see our people to see themselves struggling to solve their problems, so we can stop thinking that white power is going to solve our problems. Kamala Harris is not going to solve our problems. Barack Hussein Obama is not going to solve our problems, okay? You can vote them in tomorrow, honey, and you still going to be oppressed, okay? Because remember, Barack Obama called us thugs when we were rising up to fight for Freddie Gray, way before Donald Trump called you thugs for fighting for George Floyd. So we go out there, we politically educate our people, we pull them into the organization so they can partake in the struggle and leading, you know, it forward. And we understand that this is where we have to be to really solve the issues of our people, is to be amongst our people and to be informing our people and getting their participation in this, because we really believe that as Black Hammer, we have to be willing and humble servants to the people. So that's why all of our projects really represent the material interest and the crisis of the needs of our people currently, and us giving that to them. So land back, and thank you for this time and space to explain some of the different things that we are doing in our communities. Land back.
Land back. Thank you so much, Chief Gazi, for telling everybody about Hammer City and Hammers in Your Hood. I would like to do a little bit of imagining with y'all about what Hammer City in the Philippines would look like. This is a dream of mine as a member of Black Hammer. I would love to see a Hammer City, Philippines happen. And I know Chief Sante feels the same. So it's important to address that, Hammer City, Philippines would first and foremost be giving the land back to the indigenous people and the tillers of the land. I see people returning to the lands, right? I imagine our own schools where we will learn the true history of the Philippines and about the resilience of our people. We will have like a thriving agricultural space. I imagine it to be like a place for us to heal the land and rebuild our connection to the land, to our culture, and to our own people through sustainable living practices. I imagine myself harvesting food directly from the land and cooking our favorite meals for all of our people because I like to cook, you know what I'm saying? And like, I just see myself like swimming in the ocean, parties, right? Because Filipinos know how to party, karaoke, eating all the tropical fruits I like lanzones and mangoes, and just really feeling like I am home. And yeah, I'm getting emotional, but yes. Chief Sante, what would you what do you
back. Thank you, Chief Thru, with that. Honestly, I can't even imagine what Hammer City in the Philippines is going to look like, because it's just going to be what I've been dreaming about the whole time. And it's like every time I think about it, there's always something new that I want to add to the picture. And with Hammer City in the Philippines, it means that I can go back to my family and not have to worry about, struggling to get a job so I can pay for rent, and then have to, worry about the pandemic being out there and getting sick from COVID-19. And so I feel like Hammer City is a safe place for like overseas Filipino workers who have to work abroad in order to, earn a lot of money. Well, not a lot of money, because we don't earn a lot of money abroad, to earn money enough that we can send it back home and feed for our children. My mom is an overseas Filipino worker, and she left the Philippines when she was only 17, and like she'd been through college, she'd been through high school, and she graduated and she was educated, and she went to the United Arab Emirates to look for a job because the economy couldn't, they couldn't earn enough money to take care of their family of 8 siblings. And so my mom had left Dubai at a pretty young age. Like, she'd left Dubai when she was still, a young growing woman, and she left to Dubai and hasn't been able to get the chance to really experience her own country, her own land. Like, she's been in United Arab Emirates for like 45 years after that. Like, she hadn't gone back to the Philippines in so long. And so like, I feel like Hammer City in the Philippines, and anywhere, to be honest, is that connection to our land and the ability to go back without having to worry about whether or not we can take care of our people, because it'll be under the dictatorship of our own people, of the Filipino people who are entitled to that land, and how the resources are going to be used for that. So that's what I imagine Hammer City in the Philippines is going to look like. That we see people coming back home, because it's time people went back home. Like, I always tell my family in the Philippines that, one day I will return, and one day I will return as a free, liberated Filipino Indian person. Land back.
Land back. Thank you so much, Chief Sante. Yes, we will all return home. I truly believe it. And I just want to say thank you to Anakbayan. Thank you to Commander Chief Gazi. Thank you to Chief Sante for putting this together. Thank you so much. This has been such a beautiful and amazing experience. And yes, I would actually like to open it up for comments, actually, for Hammer City in the Philippines. If y'all don't mind, I feel like it would be cute to like know what y'all think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I remember a quote from a Filipino revolutionary who said, I'm going to butcher the quote, but he said something to the lines of, happiness is the revolution. I could not think of any other life, I believe. And so I think for the people who are really struggling in the Philippines for liberation and for genuine democracy, they're trying to find a way that they can ensure the people are happy, right? And I think, I shared that map earlier of where the revolution is currently building in the Philippines in terms of people's governments that already exist. And, I, you can just see YouTube videos of how they are and all these things. But I would just like to imagine that in those liberated areas that the people can strive to create their own happiness because they have power, right? And that's been something that's denied to the Filipino people for too long, and that for us in the National Democratic Movement, we're fighting to take that power back.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think when we're thinking about world building, the revolutionary movement in the Philippines has been doing that for decades at this point. I think about my own trip to the Philippines in 2017, where I got to integrate with Kadamay, which is an urban poor national democratic organization that had occupied abandoned government housing units in Bulacan, in the Philippines, in Luzon, in the main island of Luzon, and being able to witness them being able to seize these homes and sustain them through political education over the long-term struggle of national democracy, and them, setting up infrastructure for food, for water, for electricity, that they were, building essentially the old world, building a new world in the shell of the old, and that we see that in situations like that. We see that in peasants who are occupying huge sects of land across the countryside in the Philippines, and we see that in the establishment of the revolutionary government across the countryside, as Adrian referenced. So we're seeing a new world that is being built by the National Democratic Movement, and that socialist perspective is really what's ensuring that everyone has what they need, and everyone can feel the joy and happiness that they deserve.
Land back, beautiful. All right, y'all. I think we are coming to a close. I would like to give another thank you to Anakbayan for participating in this panel discussion with us. We are so grateful, and we are looking forward to working together in the future. I am so grateful to Chief Sante again, like I said, for putting this event together, and for Commander-in-Chief for being present for this conversation. I couldn't have expected anything greater than what has happened today. So thank you. And yeah, land back.
Land back.